Shut up and sit down.
Howdy guys, it's Andy from Big Mac's Workshop and Painting Studio, and today it's a Master of Possession from the Shadow Spear kit, and this is a lovely model. It's chock full with detail. So I'm painting it on a non-specific Legion, but it's going to be based around the word bearers colour scheme. So as always, we've got a black base, and I'm starting on the armour with Eshin Grey, and I'm glazing it on nice and lightly, as we're going to have a very pale grey colour using glazing and obviously various highlights. So as you can see, the layers are really thin, and this allows you to get a good consistency over all the armour sections, and you then start to build up the colours ever so gently. So I'm using Vallejo's Dark Sea Green at this point, and this is going to be the first highlights, and this is a very dark colour, but it's slightly darker than Eshin Grey, which has also got a slightly green hue to it. So it just layers up really nicely over the top. Again, this is glazing, so it's going to take a little while to start seeing any defects. So once the Dark Sea Green settled, we're now mixing Vallejo's Black Grey with Eshin Grey to make a slightly shaded version of the Eshin Grey. We're working from the bottom, again using the glazing techniques, and we're just pulling that paint, stretching it nice and thinly up to the lighter sections of the shaded areas, and also from the tops of the inside of the shin where it's overlooking itself. And next it is Dark Sea Green with Wolf Grey for a highlight colour, and we're just again focusing towards the raised areas. We're also doing sort of an edge highlight. It's quite a thick glaze at this point, just to bring that colour up. As you can see on the foot, we're accelerating the highlight a little bit, just to get a nice finish, what you'd expect. So you can get a really vibrant colour while still using glazing if you just use a slightly thicker paint than you normally would, and you still have a reasonable amount of control on the paint itself. So next it is onto the gloves and the pouches, which is the Scale 75 black leather, and this is quite a purpley colour. You've seen us use it a couple of times now. Again, really thin coat, and we're just building that colour up because you get a lot of interesting depth with the black leather, and once you start mixing the leather range from the Scale 75s, you do get a really cool transition on the leather work. So next it is a touch of red leather has gone into the black leather now, and we're starting to use this as a highlight, but it's going to be quite broad at the minute because obviously we're using just the black leather as a base tone. So the red leather now goes off with quite a broad highlight. If you look onto the pouch, we're covering all but the smallest sections of the item with the red leather mix. And this is going to start bringing up some real nice highlights, and you're going to start seeing some real cool definition into it. So from here on in, we're starting to add some brown leather from Scale 75 as well. So this section's largely Scale 75s, and this is going to start adding to the larger highlights now. So you're going to start picking up that browny orange colour from the red leather and the black leather, and it's going to start being raised to a real nice tan with the glazing method using these colours as they get progressively lighter towards the upper regions. So at this point we're adding orange leather to the mix, and we're starting to focus it now towards the edges. I'm doing a sort of a glazed feathering sort of technique, and just to focus the edges, and just pulling the paint away from the centre of a model. So starting towards the edge, starting away from towards the centre and pulling it towards the edge. So you get a sort of nice feathered technique, and the orange leather really starts to pick out the detail now. So I've added some Iroko at this point, and Iroko's quite a yellowy colour. and it's starting to add it to the highlighted, the extreme highlights now. And it's starting to pick out the detail work, and you're really going to start to see the interesting layers build up as you start to get this towards the end result what you're desiring. So once we've got the Iroko down, it's birch added into the mix, and this is quite a bright colour. You could use bone white or any of the carrot stone type colours for this, and you're just using it on the final highs. We're also going to add some flaws into the leather as well to make it look a bit more natural. Going to throw a couple of dots of a darker colour in there and a couple of dots of the this light colour in. Just to add some flaws, make it look like the leather's being used. And finally, back to the black leather, just to add some shading to where we've put the highlight sections for the flaws. And it really starts to add a whole load of definition to the model. And you can really start to see these details just really pop. So onto the cloak, and we're starting with Tinderlost Red, which again is scale 75 paint. As you know, we've been using a lot of scale 75s, but again, using the glazing techniques, we're using a really thin coat, and you get a nice, rich red colour. But it's going to take a couple of layers because the paint is so thin. But the effort, the end result, is totally worth it. So whilst we're waiting for the Tinderlost to dry, we've finished off the leather work with a very thin wash of Reekland Flesh Shade, just to bring some of the highlights together, and you get a real nice finish with that. It just ties all the scruffy highlights a little bit together with the base coats, and just tidies everything up, and you get a nice finish from this this stage. So back onto the cloak, and it is black leather going into the recesses of the cloak itself, and this is just to add a bit of depth and definition into the model, so you can really start to see where you're working with. So I've got my Tinderlost Red again, and I've added some scale 75's deep red. It's kind of like a corn red, and we're just starting to pick out the highlights now. The paint's really thin, but it's not quite a glaze. We're just building that colour up a little bit, just where the Tinderlost Red was. Also going slightly into the black red as well, sorry, black leather as well, just to pull the colour together, so you get a subtle shade difference between the two areas. So this stage is now deep red, just pure deep red at this point, obviously thinned down, and we're just starting to build up those highlights now, and you're getting a really cool finish as you start to focus on the more outstanding sections and bring those colours up to a real vibrant highlight. So I've added fuchsia to the deep red now, which is very, very vibrant and quite pinky, but actually works really nicely as a highlight. I was just trying this out as it's a completely new mix. I've been playing around with some different colour combinations recently, and I thought I saw it and I just thought, you know what, I'll give this one a try. It gives a really interesting finish. It gives quite a natural faded look to the raised areas. So you do actually, it does actually work really nicely. Just be careful when you're using colours like this, just to make sure that you don't go over the top, because it can lead to some very strange colour mixes. So now I've added some Iroko, which is the yellowy colour from the leather sections, and this is going to be sort of the final highlights now, and it really starts to bring that model together, and you get a really cool nice highlight, and you can just see how the colours have transitioned nicely. Even though it's not being glazed, you've just done subtle highlights and shades onto this particular section. It just makes it look a little bit different to the rest of the model. So next it is onto a staff. So I've based the staff with GW's Rhinox Hide. Again, really warm colour, but I'm contrasting that with the coolness of the armour plates. Now Rhinox Hide's quite a reddy brown. So we're going to be using a lot of more tame colours to bring the Rhinox hide down to a more of a neutral brown. Take away some of that red, which is obviously going to clash with the cloak. I'm also basing the fur on his cloak in the same colour. The next is walnut, which is quite a flat brown. I'm adding that to the Rhinox hide to get the subtle transition, but it's starting to make it more of a natural neutral brown rather than too much on the red spectrum. But I chose Rhinox hide because it's quite dark, and I'm just building up that colour layer over the baseline just to pick out the detail. So again, adding some orange leather just to brighten it up a little bit, and this is starting to work towards the highlight areas. I'm just pulling in any of the wealth of detail what this model's got. So now I'm adding some Iroko into the mixture, and this is working towards the upper sections of any of the flaws and knots in the woodwork. I'm also going to just pull the paint towards the recesses, but obviously it's going to be using quite thin layers so you can stretch it a little bit, because you don't want the highlights to go too far into the darker sections, as otherwise that just look weird. So at this stage I'm starting to add some Agrax Earthshade into the recess areas, and just picking out the detail work with the Agrax and painting it in. It's really thin at this point. I'm just painting in the wash around the model, and as it's such a thin paint, you can get a really nice controlled amount of shade to it. So now I'm added some more Iroko into the mixture and keeping those highlights, highlight colour really thin. And I'm starting to focus the highlights now towards the upper edges of the highlights, really making them stand out, because I'm just going to pull this colour together with a gentle wash, which is going to be coming up next. So now it's Agrax Earthshade wash, really thin down, and it's going to pull the depth and the highlights together, and also blend any colours what haven't been blended correctly, allowing the overall effect to be much more smooth. So next it is the metalwork, which is GW's, no it's not GW's, it's Vallejo's gunmetal. Can't go wrong with gunmetal for any of the inner workings of Space Marine armour, just a good all round colour. And once that's gone down, it is then shaded with Nuln Oil. Again, as always, I thin this down, so I'll usually use 2 or 3 layers. It just allows you to build up the colour depth a lot more naturally, and gives you a bit more control with the wash. So onto the trim work now. I've started off the trim with Warlock Bronze by GW. It's going around all the trim work, around the knees, shoulder, all that sort of stuff. As a Chaos model, is covered in trim, so just take your time, you don't want to rush it. Warlock Bronze is a very strong colour, so even when you do thin it down a bit, it gets a really nice coverage. So onto the trim again, and we are using GW's Hash Up Copper, going straight over the top with of the Warlock Bronze. Really nice, vibrant, reddy orange, reddy copper colour. And you get a really cool finish over this, and you get so it really starts to stand out against these nice cool armour colours. Once that's gone down, it is now Runelord Brass, starting to thin down the colours and also be more precise on the highlights. I'm starting to work towards the upper reaches of it, and it's just going to start to blend those colours nicely together, and you're going to start getting a really cool highlighted look. So once you're happy with the Hash Up Copper, it is now Sycorax Bronze, yet another GW one, and I'm starting to focus this on the upper reaches. on all the leading edges. Sycorax Bronze is a really nice colour. There's other variants out there from different ranges, but this one tends to be the thinnest, so it makes for a really good highlight, but you can't use it for much else. So I've now added a touch of chainmail into it, just to finalise those highlights, and really starting to focus on the upper edges. You get a very vibrant colour at this point, so just be quite sparing with it. You don't want it to be overpowering, so just be sure to make sure you thinned it down correctly. So I'm now added just a bit of pure chainmail now. I'm using my smallest brush, or one of them, just to get the final points of it, and just focusing towards the extreme points and the extreme upper edges. Being really light, and you're trying to use the side of a brush wherever possible, as this just allows you to get a bit more control, and you don't want it to be too stark. But once that's gone down, I've now got a 50-50 mix of Nuln Oil and Agrax, which is obviously thinned down, and that's going to start adding some shade into all the recesses of the trim. I'm going to do a couple of coats of this just to make sure I get plenty of depth on the models, and obviously as it's thinned down you can really control it and start moving the paint around a little bit, making sure you don't get any pooling or anything. So onto the skulls. The human skulls are start off with heavy brown, which is the Vallejo colour. I get a couple of good layers on that, as there's plenty of skulls on this dude. So you want to use a couple of different variants of the bone techniques, because otherwise it just look really dull. So once I've got a decent coat of a heavy brown, I've added some birch to the mix, which is fairly similar to any of the bone colours, like Shabty bone, etc. And I'm starting to pull the detail together and sort of highlight it. It's going to take a couple of layers, and I'm going to have to build this colour up really gently. So going up from a different colour than you would normally do it. So there's an extra amount of birch into the mixture now, and I'm starting to keep the paint away from the recesses. I'm still pulling some of it into the recesses to make the blends a bit more smooth, but I'm focusing more on the upper areas, and I'm stretching that paint a little bit down into the darker sections, just to keep the model nice and blended. So again, even more birch now. It's probably about 75% birch to heavy brown, and I'm just starting to work on the upper sections now, focusing on the leading edges, but stretching it out into the although not the shaded areas, the highlighted areas are not exactly at the front, so I'm still highlighting some of the darker sections, but making the most of the effort towards the leading edges. So now I've added this pure birch at this point, and I'm just starting to pick out the final highlights now, using a very, very small brush, and picking out the highlights around the eye sockets, the forehead, all the areas what are just starting to be the real forefront where the light will catch most. And finally, I've added some ivory into the mixture of the birch, just for the final highlights, just to really make those nose and eye sockets really start to pop right on the upper sections, and you get a really cool, vibrant skull or bone in those areas. Onto the horns of his helmet now, and I've done that as you know, I've done that in a different way. I'll start off with Doombull Brown by GW, which is really rich orangey red, orangey brown, should I say, and getting a nice coverage over that. So what I'm going to do is going to blend them in with the helmet as well. You get a cool sort of transition from the skull to the horns. The skull on the helmet and his staff is based in Iroko, which comes as a bit of a surprise to me, as even though I painted it, I can't remember this particular paint doing that. But yeah, I've got a couple of layers of Iroko now, so you got this sort of a yellowy bone for the helmet and the skull and its staff. So once I've got a decent layer of that, I've added some birch to it, and just starting to pick out the detail work, focusing around all the brow and the forehead, obviously making an effort to bring the teeth and eye sockets out as well. So I'm just adding more and more birch to this colour as I layer this up. This is just standard layering at this point. Nothing, no real fancy techniques, as the depth of the details are really nice. So you can just keep on pulling those bands in. As long as you keep the bands nice and thin, you can layer up to your heart's content. Just keep adding thinner and thinner layers with a bright colour, and you get that cool effect as well. So adding even more birch to it, and I'm bringing those highlights up, really focusing now around the eye sockets and the nose and the teeth. I'm doing exactly the same onto the helmet as well, just at the same time as painting the skull on the staff. So now I've mixed the Nullman Agrax mix again, thrown a gentle wash off of there, and starting to layer it up again with the lighter colour of birch and Iroko. And you can see the depth is really starting to stand out now alongside those deep recessed shades. So now I'm adding some now I'm going over the horns with orange leather to start getting the tone right. I wanted a reddy brown, but obviously it needs to work with the skull it's sitting on, otherwise it just looked kind of weird. So I'm just lightening that dome ball up with the by going over the top with the orange leather, and it's going to start bringing the colour together nicely. So I've added some birch now to this, and I'm just starting to highlight. I'm highlighting the inner edges on this on the curved horns, but I'm also going to highlight the upper edges as well. I just wanted the light to hit it in a kind of a weird way, make it look really interesting, because it's got a kind of a cool shape to it as well. Even more birch into the orange leather, and as you can see I'm just starting to pick out those highlights now, and you can start seeing the shape of these really nicely sculpted horns. As you can see, I'm still brightening up that inside edge on the helmet's horns, but I'm also going to still work on the upper edges as well. So whilst I was waiting for things to dry, I used greenskin flesh on the eyes of both the helmet and the staff. And I've just also done the same on, he's got an eye on his knee plate, which I thought would look good in the same colour as well. After the green shade flesh, I'm using goblin flesh. Both of these are scale 75 paints, but you can just use the orcish colours from GW, which would do the job just fine. I'm just starting. This just adds a lovely bit of brightness to the colour, and you start to the eyes really start to glow. I'm just going around some of the jewellery now, and just adding some chrome onto the jewellery just to make it stand out a little bit, and just to get a nice sort of shiny look to it. I'm also doing the same on the horns on the dude as well. So onto the fire. The fire was based in blood red. Once I got a base coat by hand, I went to the airbrush at this point. So I've got a little bit of airbrush work on this guy, but not a whole lot. Onto the fur of the cloak. So this was based in Rhinox hide, and now I've mixed some Terra Earth, which is kind of a blondie colour, and I'm just sort of using a gentle overbrush technique, trying to pick out the individual sections of the fur with a mixer of the Terra Earth, and just to start bringing up that detail work. So I'm now adding some more Terra Earth to it. It's quite a flat colour, so you're getting a nice natural shade to it. And I'm just picking out those the individual strands of fur now. It takes a hell of a long time doing it this way, but it is worth it in the long run. but patience ain't my strong point, so I do sometimes rush this sort of stuff. I've added some more now. As you can see, I'm using the 00 again, and I'm just picking out those individual sections, focusing towards the upper areas now, as we don't want the lower sections to look too bright, because that just end up looking really weird. So finally, one last layer. This is pretty much pure Terra Earth at this point, and I'm just picking out those most exposed areas now of the fur, and you're starting to get a nice blondie shade to the upper sections. It just adds that nice little bit of depth of colour to it, and you do get a nice finish at the end of the result. So the ropes now, after they've been blocked out in black, I'm now going over them in Sycorax Blue by GW. They're quite a vibrant colour. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with these, so I went with a cool colour, just to tone down the rest of the warmth of the entire model. So I've gone around all the skull straps on the skulls. I've done them all in the same colour, just to bring them all together. So now I've added some Moonray flesh to the Sycorax, and it's just to lighten it up, because I'm not going over the top with the highlights on these, because it's not a primary part of the model. You still want them to look good, so just adding that Moonray flesh just to brighten up a bit, starts to add those highlights where it needs to be, and it just makes the rest of the model, it really complements the rest of the model. And just a touch more of the Moonray just as a final highlight, and you get in there a nice complementary colour alongside all those warm reds and browns. So with the airbrush, I'm now using Sol Yellow for the lower sections of the fire. Obviously this can be glazed in. I'm not particularly good at getting a fire done by hand. Still something what I've not mastered yet. Well, I say mastered. I'm far away from mastering anything really. But I'm telling you what I've gone through to give you a bit of advice. So I'm using the Sol Yellow working towards the bottom sections, because the fire is hotter towards the lower sections, and is blood red going from above at the higher sections, just to blend that colour together. Keeping this really gentle. I've dropped my PSI right down, keeping real control over the airflow, and I'm just really gently getting that fire to really start to pop. So now is a Bloodfest Crimson, which is a real vibrant deep red, and that's going right at the top, so it really starts to stand out and make the fire look a bit more interesting. I've been careful not to overspray too much as well, as that was the last thing I really wanted, too much OSL. So going on to the armour, I've now added some of the dark green, sea green and wolf grey together, and I'm just picking out everything with some final edge highlights just to really make the armour a bit more bright, because I've got some really cool vibrant highlights on some of the other sections. I'm just brightening up the armour just to really make it stand out and make it look a bit more interesting, a bit more in character with the rest of the model. So now on the feathers, he's got a couple of bird feathers on his cloak as well. So I wanted something really interesting and really colourful. So I went for Arthan Jade, which is a sort of a turquoisey colour. A really interesting colour, what I'd never thought I'd ever use. And it's quite fun to do it, because even though it's a cool colour, it's also very vibrant. So you get a really cool contrast against the darker armours. So next it is Surfer Orc Flesh, which is a very vibrant turquoise. It's like a orc turquoise sort of colour. It's got a coolest name ever. These are both scale 75s, and I'm bringing those highlights up on the feathers with this really vibrant turquoise. And right for the top highlight, it is Caribbean Blue, again scale 75. Just finishing it off at the leading edges, and you get that nice highlights what we've got going off through the rest of the model as well. And there we go. That's a Master of Possession done in a non-specific Legion colours. What do you think? I really enjoy this model. Really loads of fun to paint. There's loads of character to him. So, obviously, we've got our thank yous to make, as always. And massive thank yous to every one of you guys for watching. Please, if you want to see more of this sort of content, hit like, hit subscribe, share with your friends. So we've got shout-outs going out to the Orc Boys, Love Minis, Ludwig Hofbauer, Warren, D-Wack, Kit Lindquist, Acmus of Dawn and Mark. If you're interested in checking us out on Patreon, please hit us up on the links below. Also, we've got a thank you to the Outpost, which are our affiliate link. Check the links out. A really cool bunch of guys. You get reduced price models, and if you use our links, we get a 5% of store credit as well. Also, we have some merchandise these days. We've got a small range. Check out Teesprings. Every little helps if you do want to help us out, whether it's through using our links or just sharing and subscribing. So anyway, guys, thank you for watching, guys, and we shall see you in the next one. Bye-bye.